Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on decoding the 2025 NDAA, What You Need to Know. I'm your moderator, Andrew Clevenger, Defense and National Security Editor at CQ and Roll Call. This webinar is hosted by FiscalNote, the #1 most comprehensive and trusted solution for managing policy and global risk with unparalleled depth and breadth of data, content, and expert analysis. Home to CQ, Roll Call, Oxford Analytica, and Dragonfly Intelligence, FiscalNote empowers the world's leading organizations with critical insights and the tools to turn them into action. To learn more about FiscalNote and its family of brands, visit fiscalnote.com and follow us on social media. As is our norm, we will be recording this session and will share it with you via email later this week. We highly encourage you to submit your questions into the Q&A feature on the bottom of this window. Joining our conversation today are John Donnelly and Brianna Riley, who are both national security and defense reporters for CQ Roll Call. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. Let's dive in. Brianna, why don't you start by bringing us up to speed on where the NDAA stands currently in the House and then in the Senate?
Sure. I'll start with the House. The Armed Services Committee voted 57-1 on an overly bipartisan vote, with just Ro Khanna again dissenting, to adopt the bill. That then teed up a floor vote in which it was approved in a 217-199 vote. 6 Democrats joined Republicans in voting for the measure, but that lopsided vote came after a host of culture war-related amendments were adopted to the bill, pushing it further to the right, sort of mirroring what we saw in the fiscal 2024 House version of the NDAA. In the Senate now, the Armed Services Committee did adopt its version behind closed doors on a 22-3 vote. We do not know exactly what's in that version of the bill, just because, as I mentioned before, it happened behind closed doors, and all we've gotten so far released publicly is a 30-page executive summary of the text. We do not know when the full text is going to be released, and it's unclear when exactly the entire chamber will be voting on that legislation.
Okay, so we know more about the House than we do about the Senate bill.
Exactly.
John, what are the differences in the top lines, and what accounts for the difference in the top lines between the two bills?
Well, the House bill came in at $895.2 billion, which was the level the administration requested and also the level set by law, by the debt limit agreement of 2023. And the Senate's comes in at $923.3 billion, which is higher than that requested or budget cap level. There's roughly a $28 billion difference between those two figures. The Senate Armed Services Committee says that they added $25 billion, but this is one of the things that we need to kind of sort out once we finally see the bill text and the all-important report that accompany the Senate Armed Services Committee measure. We'll see some of the details on that. So, and that will also help us understand some of the ways that the Senate bill, where they put some of that additional money. The House bill was heavily leaning on improving the quality of life of military personnel. They have their personnel portion of the bill is $3.83 billion higher than the administration's request. So that was a big priority for them. Of course, both bills added and subtracted here and there. But in terms of where the Senate bill put its additional money, as Brianna said, all we really have to go on right now is what some senators have said and this executive summary. But there are a whole bunch of places where they said they increased funding, and I'll just rattle off a few real quick. They said they increased funding to increase members of the Air National Guard, but there are no specifics there in how much money. Is that an end strength increase this year, or is that preparing to increase it in future years? Barracks for unaccompanied military personnel, improving the quality of those residences, dealing with the forever chemicals called PFAS. Military construction, they apparently funded a bunch of unfunded requirements and perhaps reduced some other things. We have yet to see the details on that. Big emphasis on unmanned assets, whether in the air, at sea, or on ground, and also encountering enemy drones, which are proliferating and a huge problem, especially in the Middle East. Munitions is a big thing. The Army Infantry Squad vehicle is being accelerated, and it is also costing money when you block the military's ability to retire assets that they want to retire, notably such as F-22s and F-15Es. So those are some of the increases, but again, the dollar figures are hard to come by at this stage.
Interesting. Brianna, John referred to a kind of a big push to address the quality of life for service members and their families in this bill. How are the two bills addressing this issue?
Sure thing. There's a really big caveat that I again have to that I think we'll continue returning back to during the course of this conversation, which is we still haven't seen the Senate bill text, right? So all we know really is what was disclosed to reporters during a background briefing the day the executive summary was released, the summary itself, and as John said, what senators have disclosed to the press in separate interviews or in their own media availabilities on this. I will start, though, by focusing on the House. I mean, I think just looking at the title of the bill itself is really indicative here of where the House's priorities lie. It's called, and I'll read from this so I don't screw it up, but it's called the Service Member Quality of Life Improvement and National Defense Authorization Act. That really does indicate that they were relying heavily on the quality of life panel that was bipartisan, led by Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska, a Republican, and Representative Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, a Democrat. A lot of their recommendations, which were released in April, were shoehorned into this bill. And that includes, really notably, I think one of the most headline-grabbing things about this bill is the fact that it would increase junior enlisted pay by 19.5%. So the White House had included a 4.5% across-the-board increase for troops. The House version took that a step further by really focusing on the E1 to E4 personnel and adding in a 15% increase. The thing that we don't, this is one area where we know where the Senate Armed Services Committee did come down. Elizabeth Warren told reporters after the open subcommittee markup that the panel did endorse a 4.5% across the board increase as the White House had sought, but for the E1 to E3 personnel, that's another difference. It was only a 1% additional increase. So that would bring their total to 5.5%. Now, we don't really know where the Senate ended up on like the basic needs allowance and other key initiatives that were a big focus of the House quality of life work. So we'll have to see where that ends up when the text is released.
That's a big difference, 4.5%, 5.5% to 19.5%. Just as a reminder, please, if you're viewing and you have a question, please submit it in the chat portion of the webinar. So, John, what would you highlight as another major indicator of the chambers and parties' different approaches to this year's NDAA?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences in what Brianna called culture war provisions, which is sort of our shorthand for the extremely partisan or at least politically controversial provisions that the House has put in this year, not only in their NDAA, but also in their defense appropriations bill, which is actually, as we speak, being debated on the House floor. And they did the same thing last year. And last year, most of what they did fell by the wayside once the final NDAA and Appropriations Acts were enacted. Although I will say that the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at the Pentagon were substantially gutted by last year's NDAA. But some of the things that are in the House bill led Democrats to vote against it on the floor. Even some of them on the House Armed Services Committee had supported it, such as Adam Smith. And by the time they were done with it on the floor, it was not something that they could support. And I would say the most controversial provision, arguably, is restrictions on reimbursing travel and other expenses for service members who need to go travel to obtain reproductive health services. In addition to that, you have restrictions on climate change programs, making the military more resilient to climate change. You have a requirement that all personnel actions in the Defense Department be done according to merit, as opposed to things like race. Similarly, The House bill would ensure that selection criteria at service academies is likewise focused on merit and not other characteristics. There's a ban on using TRICARE funds to support gender transition medical services and things of that ilk. And similarly, the House Appropriations Bill, they may have even gone a little bit farther on some of these things. But that's definitely a difference between the two chambers and between the two parties that is going to play out. But again, it's likely that most of these things fall out, that the House members had an opportunity to send a political message with their votes. But at the end of the day, in the conference, I wouldn't expect many of these things to survive.
That's how it played out last year, right?
Correct. Except for the DEI stuff, a lot of which stayed in.
Okay. Brianna, it feels like submarines have played an outsized role in the discussion of the NDAA. Can you speak a bit to the disagreements over the procurement rate for Virginia-class subs and how that relates to the deal between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. known as AUKUS?
Yeah, this has been a big issue in this NDAA and also in the appropriation cycle. So the background here is that since fiscal year 2011, the U.S. has procured these Virginia-class attack submarines at a rate of 2 per year. The Navy wants to break from that in fiscal 2025, so they would only procure one in over the next budget cycle. That's a big deal. Well, I should probably give the rationale first. The Navy has cited constraints regarding the Fiscal Responsibility Act / debt limit deal. The spending caps there, they argue, have really sort of forced them to tighten their belts in a lot of ways. And then the other thing that they keep citing too is capacity constraints related to the submarine industrial base. There is a pretty similar approach actually in the House and Senate versions of the NDAA on this one. Both chambers, the House in particular, and followed by the Senate, though we haven't seen the exact language, want to authorize $1 billion to begin procurement of a second Virginia-class submarine in fiscal 2025. So there is that sort of bicameral interest in doing that. We'll have to see where the appropriators end up on this, but it's also important to note that these Virginia-class submarines are pretty critical for this trilateral defense pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, known as AUKUS. Under the deal, basically the UK and the US are helping Australia for the first time develop a domestic nuclear-powered submarine industrial base. And that involves, on the US end, selling at least 3 Virginia-class attack submarines to Australia in the 2030s. However, there's some issues there on the US side, which chiefly relate to the production rate of these submarines. Right now, the US is producing them at a rate of around 1.3 subs per year. That needs to increase to 2.33 by the time that the US starts positioning itself to sell these submarines to Australia in order to both meet the pledge that the US has made to transfer these submarines and fulfill the US defense domestic needs too. So there's some concern from lawmakers here that by not sending that clear demand signal to industry that 2 per year should continue to be bought in fiscal 2025, that industry will be ill prepared, and that our allies, Australia and the UK, will get a bad signal about the US's commitment to AUKUS.
Thank you. I think I may have misspoke earlier when I encouraged folks to put their questions in the chat. People who have put them there, we see them and we'll get to them, but please use the Q&A feature of this webinar to submit your questions. Apologies on that. John, other than the issues we've already discussed, what do you think some of the most consequential provisions that you're tracking as the 2 bills move through the legislative process are?
Yeah, I think one issue that we haven't brought up that actually could get more publicity than anything else is the requirement apparently in the Senate Armed Services Committee's bill, requirement for women to register for the Selective Service. And I don't think there's anything similar to that in the House Armed Services or the House passed NDAA. So although the House bill does have a provision to automatically enroll everyone in the not everyone, but right now just men. They don't require women to sign up, but so the way it would work under the House bill is all men would be automatically enrolled. They wouldn't have to actively do so themselves. They would just automatically, be included on that list. They wouldn't have to show up and register as has been the tradition. But the bigger deal is the possibility of women having to register for a draft that may or may not ever happen. But it is definitely a political football. And so it could engender a lot of heat and sparks during the debate. So that's one in terms of controversies. I would say on the lower level of controversy, another provision in the House NDAA would require that the administration create a strategic anti-ICBM site on the East Coast of the United States. I don't think the Senate bill has anything similar that we've seen. Another thing that will be a bit of an issue is the F-35 procurements. The administration requested 68 of them across the services. The Senate Armed Services Committee ratified that. The House passed NDAA, says, no, you're getting 58 instead of 68. And the $1 billion that is saved as a result is going to be plowed into additional development work that is needed on these aircraft. And so that's going to be a point of contention. And I should point out that the House Appropriations Bill would provide money for, I think it's 76 F-35s, 8 more than were requested. So they're going even higher than the Senate Armed Services Committee. So there's multiple approaches. And of course, the Senate Appropriations Committee hasn't weighed in yet. But there's a bit of money, and it's certainly a high profile program that affects a lot of lawmakers and their constituents.
Well, while we're talking about F-35s, I have a question from an attendee. Could you discuss the status of the amendment to force Lockheed to sell the technical data of the F-35 to the DoD?
If I'm remembering correctly, I believe that was brought up in the House Armed Services Committee's debate over the chairman's mark, and I believe it was ruled not in order. It couldn't be taken up even though it had broad bipartisan support. I am not sure if I believe that there was an F-35 amendment from Representative Smith related to the F-35 as well that relates to, or that is potentially up for consideration on the floor as it relates to the Defense Appropriations Bill, but I do not recall off the top of my head if that was made in order. John, do you happen to know anything about this?
My memory is also a little fuzzy on it, but I definitely remember it coming up. I don't know whether it was withdrawn or exactly what happened procedurally, but I don't believe it got a vote. And the consensus that I took away from the committee was that this is a can of worms, right? This has implications not just for the F-35, but for intellectual property, maybe even more broadly than the defense industry, right? So it's one that I think my impression was that on both sides of the aisle, members recognize that this would require a bit of discussion and consideration before it is acted on precipitously. That's not to say it won't come up this year and maybe again next year and going forward. But it's definitely a thorny one that I got the impression that members wanted to steer clear of, at least in the near term.
I think it is indicative, though, of the frustration that lawmakers are feeling regarding the most expensive weapon system in U.S. history, right? It's the Pentagon has not been able to accept or has refused to accept deliveries of the F-35 since July 2023 because of software issues regarding Technology Refresh 3, which is a key enabler of Block 4, the modernization suite. So I think we are seeing that sort of play into at least the defense authorization fight. We'll see if it affects appropriators, at least Senate appropriators' approach too. But
Yeah, I agree. And I would underscore what Brianna just said about the level of frustration. You know, the fact that the House Armed Services Committee cut 10 F-35s from the request is itself quite noteworthy. You know, if you look back across on like the last 10 years or so, the Congress was providing the Pentagon with F-35s hand over fist. You know, and they were coming fast and furious. And here we are. It's certainly noteworthy that they're really putting the brakes on, and it's a bipartisan thing. You know, when we talked to House Armed Services Committee staffers about this, it was the top GOP staffer who was really making the point that it's hard to argue that they need as many as they are seeking when they can't even use the ones that are coming off the production line right now.
Yes, so definitely stay tuned on that issue. It is going to be with us for a while. There's another question here I'm seeing from Larson Frisbee, indicating that they intend to oppose a non-germane anti-money laundering floor amendment that a senator plans to introduce. Do you guys have anything to add on anti-money laundering proposal that may be coming? And do you know anything about the timing of that? And when do we expect to see the NDAA on the floor of the Senate?
I have nothing on the anti-money laundering front, but John, I'll defer to you on any conjecture about NDAA timing.
Yeah, I'm not clear on. I don't really have any information about that particular amendment, but I think the objective, at least on the Senate Armed Services Committee, is to bring this to the floor sometime in late July. But that has to be that's a floor scheduling is a leadership issue, and it has, to my knowledge, not been no final decision has been made about when that might come up. I also, while we're on that subject, I happened to notice a question in the queue about the possibility of the Senate not voting on the NDAA on the floor and just taking the Senate Armed Services Committee passed bill and going to a conference with the House. To answer that question, I have actually not heard that as a live option this year. Although I wouldn't put it past the Senate to do that, depending on what's on the agenda. Like last year, I know at least last year they didn't bring the defense appropriations bill to the Senate floor, and there have been times when they haven't gotten to it, the NDAA. So I would certainly consider that to be a possibility. I can't really assess the likelihood though at this point. But I'm glad you raised it because it's going to make us start to ask a little bit about that now.
Absolutely. I'm seeing another question here from an anonymous attendee about special operations authorities expanding to train and equip friend countries to include resistance operations and foreign international defense operations. Have you all seen any language resembling that in either of the bills or in any of the amendments that have been discussed so far?
No,
haven't.
that did not come up during the Senate committee briefing to reporters regarding the contents of the Senate Appropriations, or sorry, Senate Armed Services Committee passed Defense Authorization Bill. And I don't recall seeing that in the 30-page executive summary, so we'll have to wait for the full text, at least on the Senate side. I don't recall specifically looking for that language in the House side. So I am not able to help you there.
Yeah, sorry, nothing's fine for me on that either.
Yeah, sometimes there are things that are even deep in the weeds for defense reporters who pore over all these amendments, and I see a question in the chat from Jeremy McCarroll about pointing out that there were 1,300 amendments introduced to the House bill, and he's particularly interested in amendments that relate to investments from Chinese companies. Do you guys remember where they came down on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So I know in committee, the China Select Committee leadership, so the Republican majority worked with a number of offices. So backing up a little bit, the China Select Committee in the House is now has a new chairman. Rather than putting out a report targeting sort of this type of language that would hopefully influence the NDAA, they've taken a different approach this year, which is to work directly with members who are sort of dual-headed on China Select and also on the Armed Services Committee. So there are, I do recall that I believe it was 7 or 8 amendments that were sort of blessed by the majority of the Republican leadership of the China Select Committee made it into the chairman's mark version of the House Armed Services Committee NDAA. I know that additional measures like the 1260H stuff was, I believe that was either included in amendments that were adopted on the floor, or those were also the committee amendments. The short answer is yes. I just cannot recall the specifics off the top of my head.
Yeah, I have a hard time recalling the specifics myself, but I seem to recall that the House NDAA has restrictions of some sort on, university research programs. And maybe I'm conflating this with something that happened last year, but I'm pretty sure there's something in there that governs, federal support to Chinese organizations, for lack of a better word, that have ties to the Chinese government. But again, the details are a little fuzzy in my mind on that.
Okay. Another question coming in from the Q&A, these are great questions, keep them coming, is notes that there is a significant discussion ongoing about the Navy maintenance backlog. What position has the House and Senate taken on addressing the significant backlog and resulting impact on readiness and availability for Navy assets?
I can't remember whether they, added money for that particular program. You're talking, I think, mainly about the shipyard infrastructure optimization program, which is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar effort to shore up the public infrastructure. I can say unequivocally, though, that it is a serious concern for defense oversight lawmakers, and the reason is, it doesn't matter how many ships you can procure, how quickly, but if they can't get through maintenance on schedule, then they can't be deployed, and so they're not quite as useful as they would otherwise be. And so it is a big deal for them, but I don't remember the details about whether there was any added authorization to spend money on that stuff. There is definitely some talk, by the way, from the Navy Secretary about looking beyond I was just talking about the public shipyards, but obviously the private shipyards are having a lot of difficulty, keeping skilled workers and hiring skilled workers and maintaining their own infrastructure. And there's now talk, for the first time I can remember, about going beyond the big, private shipyards and looking to smaller yards and even not, non-traditional contractors to help with some elements of this problem of both the maintenance problem and the construction problem.
Okay.
Relatedly, I would say that there's also a focus, especially in Congress, on like building up commercial shipbuilding capacity as well. Congressman Waltz and to forget everyone who was involved, Senator Kelly and 2 other folks released a plan recently. It was about a 12-page overview type thing, sort of really underscoring the need to bolster both commercial and defense shipbuilding capacity. So that's definitely a space to be watching, both in this NDAA cycle and in the future.
Okay, we are running a little low on time. I do want to get to one more question I see in the Q&A. If you all will indulge us and stay tuned, considering the significant AI-related provisions in the previous NDAA, have there been any new developments in the 2025 bill in the House or the Senate? Artificial intelligence, what's going on there?
I think this is a really interesting time to be watching the AI space because we sort of have basically the Senate had been hosting a bunch of forums and really delving deeply into AI related provisions. And then they sort of, rather than doing like a major omnibus or overarching comprehensive bill. They sort of kicked it to the committees of jurisdiction to really hash this out. So what I'm really curious about is like what folks like Mike Rounds got into the Senate version of the NDAA. I think that'll be a really instructive space to watch going forward. So that's really what I'm holding out for. More generally regarding sort of cyber related provisions, I was sort of curious to see that it sounds like the House and the Senate versions of the NDAA both are interested in studying the potential for standing up a cyber force, which would be a seventh military branch dedicated directly to cyber. That obviously is not an AI provision, but I am still curious to see what that study would look like, first of all, whether it would be indeed mandated that it's carried out by an outside, sort of like contracted through an outside observer rather than like a Pentagon related study, and how that could potentially address like efforts to recruit specialized personnel in the cyberspace that might have more of a familiarity around AI and other sort of emerging specialized areas like that.
Okay, watch this space, I guess.
I do recall that the Senate Armed Services Committee measure requires the Pentagon to report back, and I think it's several requirements pertaining to AI, because I mean they don't have all the answers in the committees either, and they want to know from the Pentagon, what are you thinking about this? Where are you going on this? So there's definitely some reports there that in a year or two time could turn into legislation.
Okay, one last question before we wrap things up. The NDAA has been enacted into law 63 straight years. What are the chances that this is the year that we see the streak come to an end?
I'm going to say the chances are nil. Because as people have said in the past, when it's and there have been some, I've been covering this a long time. There have been some rocky stretches in the the NDAA's road to passage as it gets closer to December and January. But every time it has happened, and it's overcome some really tough odds to do so. And what people often say is, the fact that it succeeded so often works to its advantage because nobody wants to be the first to mess it up. And that's a real thing, because whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you don't want to be the first one not to get an NDAA enacted in, what is it, 64 years? So to me, that's the biggest reason to believe it'll happen again.
Well, that's a nice positive note on which to end. This has been a really insightful conversation. But we're running over and out of time. I'd like to thank John and Brianna for your time and sharing your insights with us, and to all of you in the audience for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in.